Thank you very, very much. I'm happy to be here, and I hope you will be thinking we want to have a dialogue, a Q&A toward the end, as has been the protocol when we've had time today. That's always been pretty engaging. We're pleased to have you here today. What we want to talk about is the topic, balancing stewardship and sustainable practice. And we all understand the importance, indeed, that it's critically important, the relationship between industry and our federal and state regulators. It's critically important. We also understand increasingly that industry is incorporating stewardship and sustainable practices into their daily operations. Often their bottom line demands that they do so. Many have corporate social responsibility programs, and many want to be as we call, beyond compliance. In every case, there has to be a very strong two-way relationship and dialogue between the company or the industry and their regulators. And often that relationship is, the basis of that relationship is indeed to achieve a clear understanding, two-way, very clear understanding on one hand, the expectations of regulators. The burden is on them to be clear in their discussions and interactions with the industry. And it's also somewhat on the industry's, it's their burden to help make clear to the regulators what certain things mean to their bottom line, how easy or difficult certain requirements and sustainability practices will be to achieve. Regulators want to know that. So today we want to drill down on this two-way relationship. We want to have a conversation about the understandings and expectations, the importance of identifying what's on the horizon that regulators see coming, and so that they can start that early dialogue with industry. Don't wait till the last minute, plan ahead. And the communications between regulators and industry to strike the key balance. I'm pleased that we have really smart people on today's panel. Sarah King, to my right, is with DuPont. She is the manager for climate and sustainability for that worldwide company. She's an expert. She traveled here today from Wilmington, Delaware. She's obviously in the private sector. And the important thing to note for those of us in Central Virginia is about DuPont. Their plant here in Richmond is their single largest plant in the world. I don't think many people really appreciate or fully know what an investment DuPont has in this community. We also have Dr. Paul Gilman, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Covanta Energy, which also has a pretty significant footprint here in Virginia. Covanta is one of the country's largest waste-to-energy companies. Paul has been a part of the conversation from both sides. He's in the private sector now as Covanta's Chief Sustainability Officer, but he also has, among his distinguished history, he has been with the Assistant Administrator at EPA in charge of research and development. He has been at the White House and in the Office of Management and Budget on environmental matters. And today, again, he is in the private sector. And the fun fact about Covanta is he has operations centrally, mostly in Northern Virginia, is that they process nationwide more than 5% of the entire nation's waste. So turning a lot of that waste into energy is a good thing. And then we have David Paler, who is known to many people in this room. David has nearly 40 years with the Department of Environmental Quality, nearly a decade, the last decade as Director of DEQ. His entire professional career has been spent at DEQ and started out as a fish pathologist cutting fish in the South River up in Waynesboro. My, how far you've come. So, and what we know about David is that he is very highly regarded in Virginia and is very respected among industry and others to achieve that good dialogue. Because we're talking about sustainability, sustainable practice, and balancing stewardship, let's make sure we have our definitions right. Let me make sure we're on the same page and ask each of them to say a word or two about how they define stewardship. They come from very different organizations, how they define stewardship and how they define sustainable practice. Sarah?
Sure. Thanks, Preston, and thank you all.
Is your microphone on?
I think when I think about stewardship, the first thing that comes to mind is really footprint. And I think it's about using resources efficiently. Can you guys hear me in the back?
I don't think your microphone's on.
It's about using resources efficiently. So it's about footprint. It's about turning things. What knobs and buttons do you have within your operational control, and how can you make reductions there? And then when I think about sustainable practice, I think about footprint plus your handprint. And I think handprint is kind of a term that's coming up more and more in the sustainability space. How can a company leverage its products, its supply chain, and think across its whole value chain? What kind of impact are you making, positive societal contribution?
Paul?
Let's see if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Am I live?
You're on.
Okay.
You're on.
Okay. It doesn't matter that we have maybe different views of the words. We shouldn't get hung up on that. Stewardship for us would be the fact that we're thinking about things in a future setting. You're a steward, you're worried about what you do in the future. For us, sustainability is not just a state, but it's the process. It's the process of optimizing the different elements. We've heard this morning people talk about their different pillars. For us, it's the simple model of the economic, environmental, and social or community pillar, so the three pillars. Sustainability for us is that process of balancing and optimizing those pillars.
Mr. Paler?
I definitely agree with the pillars concept. The sustainability is about especially economic, environmental, and social issues. Obviously, DEQ lives in the environmental world. I think of sustainability as living off of interest rather than principle. It can go on in perpetuity, and I think of stewardship as those responsible actions that lead to sustainability.
Let me stick with Paul, if I can, and then go to Sarah. You both are a part of very large companies who have made sustainability a central to its business operations. You brought it in-house. Paul, tell us a bit about Covanta and how Covanta has incorporated sustainability into its everyday operations, and then I'll ask the same for Sarah at DuPont.
Okay. We're very lucky in that ours was driven from the top. It was an initiative that was put together, thought through by our CEO and our board of directors. For some companies, it's an activity that takes place perhaps closer to the grassroots. Ours is from the top. The way we started it was to give it a name that meant something to the people in the company and set a wide range of goals. They ranged from moving beyond compliance into continuous improvement. So we set emissions reduction goals, even though we were compliant with our environmental standards and regulations. We set goals for engagement in the non-governmental organizations, for our communities, for our regulators. So communication, telling our story as a company, as a sector, was very important. So very broad-ranging set of goals that have now evolved into more formalized reporting and merged goals that are both financial and environmental and social. But we started with a way that our employees could really understand it, very palpable for them.
Sarah, how's it part of your culture?
So first, I think it's been a part of, sustainability has been a part of DuPont for a long time. So we set our first footprint reduction goals in the 1970s, the 1980s, and we really today are continuing to find ways to embed sustainability more deeply, both into our operations and our overall corporate strategy. I think there's a few things that have really contributed to our success and helped us get to where we are today. Like Paul, I think leadership from the top, I think CEO engagement has been really important. And because we've been working on sustainability so long, our work has spanned the tenures of several CEOs. So it's been neat to see the different stamps that each CEO can put on sustainability and kind of take it to the next level. The second thing I think about is core values are incredibly important at DuPont. And so we've got 4 core values: environmental stewardship, safety and health, respect for people, and highest ethical behavior. And when we think about what's at the essence of all of those, sustainability, both the environmental and the social aspects, are really part of each and every one of those. And so for sustainability, it's made our job easier. It doesn't end up feeling like something that we've bolted on to the company, but instead it's something that's part of the core values. It's part of the fabric of who DuPont is. And then I think the last thing is just framing sustainability as sustainable growth, and we've done that very intentionally from the beginning. And so what we're doing in sustainability is about growing our businesses. It's about increasing profits, and it's about reducing our footprint while we enhance shareholder and societal revenue. And so we work really hard, and I think that philosophy is reflected in how we set our corporate sustainability goals, how we track progress, and how we communicate that to our stakeholders.
I noted that David Paler has been highly regarded in Virginia among all stakeholders for his ability to engage and strike a balance. He's been with DEQ for, as I mentioned, for almost 40 years. As a regulator, you help make policy. You recommend policy to the secretary and to the governor, but you also have an enforcement role. But much of your daily work is talking to folks just like this. What's been the secret to success for you as the chief regulator engaging Virginia companies?
Excuse me, I think that I saw a sign probably 20 years ago said collaborate or die. And I'm sort of, we are trying to live by that. Collaboration means open and honest dialogue. From the standpoint of the regulators, the staff at DEQ, it starts with knowing our boundaries. I think maybe in decades past, DEQs around the country, maybe thought in terms of what they wanted the law to be rather than what it was. And so we're real clear about what our boundaries are, about what is, what is fixed and what isn't. I tell our folks that their goal is to get to the hard yes, which means they got to take the time to listen to the business entity and figure out what their needs are and see if there's a way to do that as opposed to simply saying no and moving on. So our challenge is to get to yes. So we really rely on customer service. We rely on listening, and it's been my experience that if you can't get to yes on everything, but you've had that dialogue and you explain what the reasons are that something isn't going to work, that's generally pretty well accepted. What I find is that the business community wants certainty, and that's as important as what the answer is. And so another one of the rules that we try to live by is when we give you an answer, you can take it to the bank, and we're not going to change our mind next week. So you can start making your plans accordingly. So I'd say it's collaboration, communication, and certainty.
Let me follow up. We've heard a lot about EPA today. Not only do many companies here have a relationship with EPA, but you do too. And you have been honored by your peers, your other state DEQ-type directors, and has been president of the Environmental Council of the States, which is the association of DEQs. And you've often testified before Congress about EPA and mandates and some of the things that you're on the receiving end of that in turn makes your job more difficult in dealing with the regulated community? So that we have a proper understanding and can better appreciate, especially in terms as you're trying to achieve stewardship and sustainable practices and impart those messages with those you regulate. Why don't you take a few minutes and tell us your experience with EPA and what your relationship with EPA is and what the mandates may be and how that may make your job a little bit more difficult at times?
Probably about maybe 12 years ago, with the Environmental Council of the States, which is all of my counterparts, we were down in New Orleans, and with EPA, we coined the term co-regulator with them. And they didn't take it too well. But we have been trying to emphasize with EPA, and it has been gaining more and more traction, and Gina McCarthy in particular has embraced it, the fact that, that we do work alongside EPA. We are, in most cases, the primary regulator. And we have an understanding of the site-specific needs. We have a relationship, and that those things have to be honored by EPA as well. So our role at, Virginia with Philadelphia with Region 3 and otherwise is when we see rules that don't fit some of our principles of certainty and common sense and those sorts of things, we push back. And we have, I think, a healthy relationship in most cases where, we get to a place that we can both live with. So it's there's a tension sometimes between us and EPA. Sometimes, we're right side by side. But when we disagree, we the state disagree with something that EPA is doing, we do have the kind of relationship that we're able to question it and push back and try to bring some common, what we think is common sense to that. Most recently, I'd say that's happened in the ag community with EPA having some certain goals related to agriculture, and we have tried to bring our brand of common sense to that, which doesn't undercut the goal of EPA, but in that particular instance is just a different process, a different strategy to get to a good endpoint.
And one more question, just not necessarily on point, but I think it's important for folks to understand. Historically, when you look at DEQ's funding, the balance between general fund dollars going to your agency and that which you rely on for permit fees from many folks in this room, how has that changed over the years and what's its status now?
Probably back around turn of the century, DEQ was about 1/3 of its money was general fund, taxpayer revenue. We're at about half of that right now. Probably about half, not quite half of our revenue now is fees that come from folks who have permits or otherwise, and then we have some from the federal government. That pot has been reducing as well, as you know.
So the point is only 15 or 20% of your budget is really state taxpayer dollars.
That's correct. And it used to be close to twice that, not maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's important to know. Paul Gilman with Covanta, as I noted, has been on both sides of this conversation. As a federal regulator, is now on the private sector. He's been at EPA, and he's been in the White House at OMB. And he's had pretty significant policy-making responsibilities, and he has engaged the private sector. You're unique among us in that you've been on both sides. Wax on about how you think regulators do at the federal and state level, engaging the regulated community. What could they do better?
I do think, to David's point, at the state level, There's better engagement with regulated entities. They live with the entity, with the consequences of actions taken. So they are understanding, and they listen, to David's point. I think at the federal level, you're a couple steps away from that level of engagement. It's a little easier to be more theoretical. It's also probably a little more tightly wrapped in the legal basis for the regulation. So, and what I mean by that is, if a statute says you won't consider costs in a decision, they won't. And there may be more flexibility, in my experience, at the state level. So sometimes we think of the decision-making at that federal level as being outside the world of common sense. Well, it may very well be that they're prescribed to be outside that world and be only in one of the pillars, perhaps the environmental. It's very difficult sometimes for that federal EPA to think sustainably. They're not necessarily mandated to do so. So balancing the social needs, community needs, along with economic needs is a little more of a struggle. Having said that, the key is, can you put yourself in the other person's position? You have to do that as a business. When you go speak to your regulators, you've got to put yourself in their position. And oftentimes, I think at the state level, certainly experience in Virginia, the regulators are trying to do that for you as well. So it leads to a much more productive dialogue, and usually something that everyone can be happy with at the end. Everybody in the community who wants to know that they're being dealt with in a safe manner, and everyone at the respective regulated entity and among the regulators.
But at the federal level, at EPA, how common is it for EPA to really strive to put themselves in their position?
I think some programs are actually structurally suited to do that. Drinking water, for example, the drinking water legislation that sort of bounds that program really does let the regulator think through cost consequences, technology limits, and the like in a way that the air people can't quite do so. So in my experience, it's a little spotty. It depends on not just the individuals in the department and their own background, but also the underlying statutes. That does have an effect. And they are further at a distance, and they are less likely to be able to put themselves in the shoes of the people coming through the door. It's pretty easy to take a them versus us attitude at times, because they do, people spend an awful lot of time throwing rocks at them, and after a while they get defensive.
Sticking with you, you've been on both sides. Tell me an EPA regulatory success story. Tell me a failure. From Covanta's perspective, tell me a success story. Tell me a failure. And if it's a failure, it could have been a success. If what?
Well, I guess let me do a couple of them quickly. We heard this morning about difficulties being regulated under 111D. As a sector, we're regulated under 111D. Not an easy place to be. But at the end of the day, I can sit here and say with a straight face that we produce power with emissions that in the arena of the Clean Air Act give natural gas a run for their money on a per unit energy basis. That's
waste energy.
Yes, that's pretty neat. So on the one hand, it's a miserable regulatory framework, and on the other, it enables us to say to our communities, we're a high-performing power producer. So, you know, the good news is we can say that. The bad news is it cost our sector a lot to get there. And pre-Clean Air Act, there were a couple thousand facilities that did what we do. Today there are 86. So only the most economic survived. But those that did are high performers in the sector. An example where we as a sector stumbled and learned from it and built a better relationship with our regulators and our communities. A number of our facilities, their location is dictated by history. Where a community perhaps had a landfill, they'll build the power plant that uses the municipal solid waste as fuel. Or perhaps where they had an old town gas plant, something like that. These areas tend to be the more industrialized. They tend to be ones that, when there are residential communities, they're socioeconomically lower in the spectrum and become classic environmental justice communities. The whole term and the movement of environmental justice really took place, started up in a big way in Chester, Pennsylvania, when an energy from waste facility was built there more than 2 decades ago. It was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for development in that community. The facility, its acceptance, for 15 years was really a battle. But we acquired it. We learned from the mistakes of the past. We engaged the environmental justice community. We engaged the community more broadly, the regulators, to the point where today we have a very open and supportive working relationship. We learned a lot, turned it back around, and actually turned the lessons that we learned in Chester, Pennsylvania into a corporate policy on community outreach and environmental justice. I think we're only the second company in the country that has one. But it's a core value for us now. So we started out on the wrong side of the regulators, on the wrong side of the community as a sector. My company didn't own it at the time, but we got ourselves turned around. We knew we were on the wrong side of the issue. It was very much sort of a part of our wrapping ourselves in sustainability, understanding we had a responsibility to the community as well as our employees, and at the same time to the environment.
Sarah, with DuPont, kind of the same question. Under the context of sustainable practice and balanced stewardship, I'm sure DuPont has many success stories, but what is a success story? What is a failure that would have been a success but for?
Yeah, and I think, like Covanta, I think we at DuPont see a lot of opportunity engaging early and engaging often with regulators, EPA, and other regulatory agencies. I think there's a lot more upside than downside, and I think in this age, I think it's been brought up in earlier panels of that society does look to business to solve problems, and that we're not just seen as causing the problems. Now people want us to help solve them, and I think part of that is through policy. And I think a lot of that is not just maintaining the status quo, it's thinking, where are we going next? And if we don't agree with that regulatory proposal, how can we help shape it in a way that gets us to the right destination in a way that makes more sense for our business? So I think we've got lots of examples. I think there's some interesting things going on in the automotive sector. I think the CAFE standards are an interesting example to think about also in the context kind of the Clean Power Plan. DuPont supplies a lot of materials into the automotive sector globally, polymers for lightweighting, both the body and under the hood. And so I think that the whole process of developing and getting the CAFE standards across the finish line, clearly it was the OEMs who were most directly engaging with the regulators on that, but I think part of the success was that it became a conversation more broadly within that whole value chain. And so for a company that's upstream and supplies materials to those car companies, we need to be thinking, what are they going to need, and anticipating what they're going to need in 5 and 10 and 15 years to meet their regulations, and make sure that we've got innovation in our pipeline so that we're ready to deliver the products that they'll need. So I think that the successful outcome there is you've got a regulation that's flexible and technology neutral and really inspires companies to go innovate, which is what I think all of us feel like our companies do best. And then I guess on the failure side, I think probably some people are familiar with US CAP, the US Climate Action Partnership. And this was a coalition of companies, DuPont was a founding member, and large environmental NGOs that came together in 2007. And we spent a long time trying to find the center on climate policy for the US. And so we put together a robust set of recommendations and then actively advocated for the US Congress to pass a comprehensive cap and trade program. And so I think that it was a interesting process to be part of. I think we learned a lot. Ultimately, obviously, it wasn't successful. We don't have a comprehensive cap and trade program here in the U.S. But I think we learned a lot, and I think the concept of that multi-sector partnership and businesses and NGOs coming together and then really engaging thoughtfully with policymakers in a constructive way ahead of kind of like pre-conversations in a way, I think was really useful, and I hope something that we might see more of in the times to come. So that seems like a good model.
Let me ask the same question to David from a regulator's perspective. Over the many years, still under the heading of balancing stewardship and sustainable practice, what is a regulatory engagement success story, and what is a failure that you've experienced at DEQ that you wish had been successful?
My favorite site-specific success story was probably about 15 years ago at International Paper. EPA had just come out with a new methanol, technology-based methanol air emission standard. And for some reason, EPA allowed International Paper to come up with a site-specific technology. They, by being able to come up with their own plan for their site, they came up with a 50% better result, 50% fewer emissions, and it cost them 30% less than the technology MACT would have. That's sort of the premier example of what we try to do in our Virginia Environmental Excellence Program, and it has as its basis environmental management systems and developing that. I wish I had others that were as big as that, but that is an example to me of why regulators shouldn't be stuck in a rut, but should be open to site-specific examples. On the regulation front, back in 2002, we had a pretty bad drought, and realized that we needed a water supply planning framework, and it took us 2.5 years to get to that because the NGOs thought that the public utilities didn't care to leave water in the river and vice versa, and the farmers were concerned about making sure that they still had their riparian rights, and the whole collaboration thing in the end led to a water supply planning framework. For failures, usually when we've had failures, it's been because we haven't either adequately done the technical work, or we've put on too many rose-colored glasses or whatever. There was a facility out in the valley that was going to land apply a lot of industrial and some municipal wastewater as a solution for recharge, as well as for the Chesapeake Bay. It didn't work out that way, and we had to come up with Plan B. And we've had some other examples where maybe, we issued the permit complied, but for reasons of not being honest with ourselves, the compliance then suffered later. And to Sarah's point, sometimes when we have failures, it's because we've gotten in the game a little bit too late, and the failure then that's experienced is at the business end, because they've got a tighter time frame that we have a lot of trouble meeting.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to ask one more kind of set of questions and then leave 5 minutes or so for the audience, so be thinking of your questions. But we know where we've been, but looking ahead, Paul's in the energy from waste business, Sarah's in the broad manufacturing business. What are the trends on the horizon, regulatory trends? What's coming down the pike? What, from the private sector's perspective, should the regulators be doing to engage them now before it gets here? And what will, same question to David, what does he see coming down as a regulator, and what will he be doing to engage now early on? Paul?
Climate.
Say it again.
Climate.
Climate.
One word. We're a very unique producer of electricity. If you look at us on a life cycle basis, the fact that we take municipal solid waste that makes electricity out of a landfill, it doesn't generate that methane gas that's the potent greenhouse gas. So actually, when you do your calculations, we wind up being a way to produce electricity and reduce greenhouse gases. And we get carbon credits for what we do and the like. So some people see struggles in the future of climate. We see opportunities. Communities that utilize our services see opportunities. So we're kind of excited about that. It's kind of nice to think you're on the helping side of the problem in that regard. Along with that come a lot of other problems. We operate in California. We're in the midst of a remarkable drought. That we have to plan for the future is going to be the way of life. So running a small power plant that needs water becomes a challenge.
Sarah, what's coming down the pike from DuPont's perspective?
I guess like a slightly different twist on this, but what we're seeing, I think, already today, and we'll just accelerate in the future, is what we call marketplace regulation or voluntary compliance. And so this is the Walmarts of the world, NGOs, bloggers, just influencers out there delisting or banning a product or an ingredient or a material in a completely non-regulatory way. And so I think what we're seeing play out is that this is happening often even faster than it would to go through if somebody registered a complaint or something in a traditional regulatory process. And so I think, what this means for a company like DuPont is that we need to be not just looking with a very narrow scope at our regulators as we're moving our products through our pipeline and getting ready to commercialize them. We don't just need to have a product approval. What we need to be doing is looking with a panoramic view of the entire landscape and thinking about actors who we wouldn't even traditionally think of as important stakeholders for a specific product, but who could actually have a really big impact on that product's success and commercialization. And so I guess it becomes a lot about engagement too, and how do you, as companies, engage with your stakeholders in a genuine way, and how do you take that input, how do we get to the right level of being able to be nimble and find the right level of transparency too, which I think is underlying a lot of the concerns.
And to David, what's the next big regulatory thing that you need to be engaging now?
Climate. As far as trends, we're going to have to be active in terms of finding market solutions to the CO2 emissions issue and renewable energy and energy efficiency. We're going to have ways to verify that and track that and that sort of thing. And managing water more comprehensively is also going to be a pretty huge deal over the next couple decades.
It is. Larry, do we have time for one or two questions?
I think we're running a little Does anybody have a quick question for the group? Okay, thank you
All right.
guys very much.
Thank you very
for the
much.
question. Thank you. So while we're miking up the next group, I just wanted to thank Preston again for moderating that. Really appreciate that. And Paul, Sarah, and David, thank you so much for participating. We have our next